We're going to do a little bit different, so we're going to take turns. We have a lot of content to unpack for you, so I'll be kicking it off. Oh, is there a clicker? Oh, perfect. So I think one of these things is not the same as the other, so I'm the startup guy. So we're going to actually go through a framework that I use when I work and that. Oh, there we go. For teaching innovation, basically, to larger enterprises. So today we're going to unpack how to develop and deploy your Web3 strategy within your organization. We're going to go through a little bit about like what is driving Web3, the primitives behind it. Then we'll actually talk about a framework I use called the 4 Ps. Zaki will take up when we get to the Web3 for me, or for we, and then Ryan will close us out. So let's begin. There we go. So, you know, I've been an entrepreneur for 25 years, and when I sold my last company, I started helping corporations. And what I tried to figure out was like, how would I disrupt your business? How all the times that I've been an entrepreneur, what was I really doing? What was behind it? And what it really boiled down to is that there are two forces that drive all innovation, right? And to me, innovation is really the ability to weather change, not necessarily the necessity to create big change, right? But these two fundamental forces behind innovation are ultimately their culture and technology, right? We're going to unpack that a little bit further. But first, let's talk a little bit about Web3 itself, right? So Web3 is interesting because it is actually both a technological movement and a cultural movement, right? Yesterday, we had a great talk about all of the things that are happening on the technology side. But much more interesting to me is all of the cultural manifestations of Web3 itself, right? The technology is fairly straightforward. But what's really happened is this move to sort of more openness, transparency, composability, sustainability, decentralization. These are new concepts that we have to internalize in our organization. And this is actually probably the harder part for us to really internalize, right? It's easy to be like, do payments a different way, do storage a different way. It's way harder to say, hey, we should be open and we should be working with other people, right? That's a really difficult change for most companies to actually adopt. So I'm going to give you a very simple framework for how to think about and use sort of these ideas. So the 4 Ps, as I mentioned before, they're perspective, persona, process, and product. And really what they came from was understanding that when we talk about culture, what we're really talking about is what do we value and who values it, versus when we talk about technology, we're talking about how do we do something and what's the experience that we ultimately deliver, right? So we're going to look at these each one at a time. So getting into the perspective phase, this is really where you're largely challenging your organization. This is kind of that OS moment, right? Where you're like, okay, what are we gonna do and how do we disrupt ourselves, right? So this is really asking yourself the question, if we were to be a whole new business tomorrow, what would we be, right? What are our core assets? What are the key things that we understand about the world and how to operate in it that we could leverage, right? If we had to break ourselves apart. And so this really is a question of what do we value as an organization, right? Like what do the customers that we service value? And ultimately, what do we value internally as well? So in this realm of like new perspectives that you may want to like look at adopting, there's things like ownership and representation and collaboration and community, right? These are new forces that really, I think, unseat the way we've previously worked, right? Because realistically speaking, we always sort of had these black boxes where we put our arms around everything and kept everything internally. And a lot of Web3 is about undoing sort of that relationship to the world, right? It's about figuring out ways to build upon things and build together, right? It's also about inverting where ownership is. There was a great slide yesterday that talked about sort of like where the ownership model, was it Josh's? Right? I think it was, yeah. But you know, it really talked about how like ownership was inverting now, right? Like the brands weren't the owners anymore, right? Like what's really happening is we're figuring out how to do things together with our customers. Now, this is very scary, right? Because like we're used to controlling the world and owning all the parts and all the pieces, right? But there is a freeing force here once you can get your head around it, and it may not be easy. So my recommendation is find something net new to practice with before you like disrupt your key fundamental business, right? The second P, let me give you an example actually. So I'll give you, Nike has said now, if you think about Nike, has everyone seen, they bought Artifact Studios. They've They have patents on NFTs or metaverse from like 10 years ago, I believe it was, right? But here's the interesting thing. Nike said, hey, we're not going to just be a shoe company or a physical shoe company. Now we're a virtual shoe company as well, right? And you remember that what I was saying about going like into a net new area? Selling virtual sneakers doesn't do anything to Nike's fundamental business, right? Still leaves it fully intact, but creates an entirely new perspective on the world and a new opportunity that could be massive, right? That's the kind of stuff that, like, when you start to challenge how you think about the world and how you see the world, you can unlock opportunities, right? Nike didn't have to go in this arena, but suddenly they are, right? And they're gonna lead it because Nike as well, one of their best attributes is they really understand culture, right? They're really a force behind it. And that's like always gonna be a unique advantage they have. So we don't usually think about this when we're building and planning our business, but that's where we're going. So the second P, you may identify something that you value, but not everyone values it at the same rate or level yet, right? So there are early adopters, right? There are, the late adopters, right? So there's varying times where you might want to explore new sets of people to work with, much like, say, Nike, right? When they go back to that example, not everyone's in the metaverse, but a lot of people are into gaming and other things like that, and so you get these loose associations that you could pull on, right? So finding the people who care about the thing that you value is the second part of the challenge, right? Now, I want to be clear. These 4 Ps, they're not meant to be like, you don't have to use them all, right? Use the one that makes sense, right? So sometimes you just want to add some more TAM to your business, and maybe it's just finding a new persona to service, right? Sometimes you just need to disrupt yourself before you get disrupted, right? That's a new perspective. So when we look at the Web3 sort of personas, right, there's obviously Gen Z, but there's also all these new underserved groups that are finally having a voice or having the freedom to sort of be online. There's a whole new class of creatives and creators, right, that are also possible potential people for us to work with. And this is an age of fandom, right? This is a thing that we are not used to, actually, like, as large enterprises, but people really care and love things, and they actually care and love your brands as well. But we don't necessarily own that, right? We sort of like keep this arm's length transactional relationship with our customers. This is about moving to that next level. It's very difficult for a lot of brands, but there's a big opportunity when you do this. Now, let's see an example of getting to a new persona. Everyone knows Christie's. Who would have thought they're the premier place to go sell your NFTs now, right? This is, again, where Christie said, well, there's a new customer type out there. There's a new marketplace out there, and why aren't we part of it, right? They didn't change their business. They didn't change what they do or how they see the world. They just picked up a new customer, right? A whole new genre of customer that potentially can go into the fold. The Beeple, was it $65 million Beeple sold for? It was the first large NFT sale. I think it was the beginning of the bull run for the last bull. But you can see how a simple thing like going after this new customer type can actually open up your eyes and give you a lot of experience with a whole new way of thinking. The third P is process. So this is really about how we do things, right? And in the Web3 universe, how we do things can be very much like more technology driven, right? This is that right-hand side of the diagram. This is all in the technology bits. And so how do we go about making and delivering this thing is actually potentially very different as well in our organization, right? So now you're into all the techie, nerdy things, right? Blockchains, wallets, NFTs. Of course, there's memberships, there's governance models. So all of these tools exist in service of your goals, right? So the only reason to adopt these processes is because it facilitates delivering better products to new types of customers and ultimately delivering you to a new place. So let's think about an example. MGM, my friends here, they went about doing NFT ticketing for their event, right? And we'll actually have a whole bunch more about this later. Ryan will cover this, right? But the idea of switching from that traditional ticketing model to an NFT ticketing model does a bunch of interesting things, right? It gives you access to a new customer type who would want to even buy an NFT ticket, right? It also unlocks some of those lasting values about like that Web3 brings forward, right? So what can we do over time? Composability, right? Like what can we do from an integrations point of view? What can we do with this data now that we have it out there, right? And so this process change was a large change internally to try to manifest a new way of doing something that they already were doing. The last P is product. So usually when I work with brands on innovation. Everyone wants to do this stuff. It's the shiny stuff. It's the stuff that's like sexy and everyone wants to see it. But really what we care about here is delivering the best experience possible, right? When we innovate in our product realm, what are we really doing is creating new experiences for our customers. Right? And so in the Web3 realm, these new product manifestations may show up as NFTs, they may show up as digital art, collaborations, maybe crypto tokens or DeFi. It can also be DAOs or new working models and governance models. And of course, there's the virtual, I hate the word phygital, but it's a thing. But yeah, so there's a lot of ways to manifest Web3 from a product point of view as well, right? This is also usually, I would say, where most people start. Right? It is the easy thing. You can do an experiment, you can try something new out, and you can get a little bit of a taste of what's working. So give you an example, this is Gucci. They did this was like Super Gucci was the campaign. It was 500 NFTs. They did it in collaboration. This is another interesting opportunity in Web3. A lot of this work is collaborative. You don't do it on your own. You go and do it with somebody, right? When Tiffany's did theirs, they did it with, who's it, the Ape? No, sorry, CryptoPunks, right? So, a lot of this collaborative work lets you ladder up because you can go to an established person in the space, do something interesting and relevant. Gucci did 500 of these. They sold, airdropped another 500 to the same owners. Very, very small, limited supply. We were checking this morning. The floor price is about 1 ETH for these NFTs. No one wants to sell them, right? That's the kind of attachment that you're hoping for. So I know I went fast. You feel free to ask questions, but we'll get back to that afterwards. But I think I'm about to hand it off to Zach.
Okay, so this part of the presentation is where we get real and practical. Like, how do we actually put this into process? It's particularly in some of the large organizations we've worked with, we call this the Web3 for we, right? How do you take all of these strategic frameworks and contextualize it for your own business? So you probably remember or have heard the term going from 0 to 1. In the crypto space, sometimes you don't need to go to 1. You could just go from 0.000 to 0.00001 and still have a significant impact and change and progress in your organization. But essentially, think about creating a toolkit that you will use to socialize internally to build, number one, mind share and education around this new space. But number two, you have to take your team on a journey. And so the way we like to think about it is you create a package of artifacts that you can take and socialize and build alignment around. So some of those elements of that package would be creating a primer. Now, as you guys know, a lot of grounds up, community-driven crypto, NFT, blockchain projects tend to start around a white paper. So think about this as like, what's your white paper for your company, right? So that's what we call the primer. The second thing is let's take some use cases or case studies from either your industry or something similar or analogous, and how do you use that to start building some tangible understanding of like what's the art of the possible. Then you move to a exercise where you're basically mapping that art of the possible across sort of a broad framework. And then you move into coalition building, which is what are the teams that I need to have on board to make this real? And then finally, some guiding principles. So one example of a guiding principle that we've come across a lot with some of our large brand clients is particularly when it comes to integrating with core back-end source IT systems, like a loyalty system, et cetera. For a lot of companies, that's like a non-starter. They're like, we're not going to touch our loyalty roadmap for like 18 months. So whatever you create or dream up with, it has to work on its own as a standalone. So think about how you put this together for your company. And we'll just go through a little bit more detail here. For example, the primer. The primer is where you synthesize all your thinking, right? And what are some base case educational terms that everybody needs to understand? What is the state of Web3 today in terms of landscape? And a lot of people will be interested to know that it differs by geography. So when we started our journey a few years back with one of our clients, Asia was where it was at in terms of that industry. But a lot of the company that we were working with was headquartered in the US, and they weren't aware of all this activity that was happening in their space, particularly in crypto. So trying to lay that out for them. What are the latest headlines, right? And this is what everybody usually has a visceral reaction to when they think about Web3 and crypto. They read the headlines, and sometimes it's always doom and gloom, or it's very, very volatile. But what are the headlines that really matter to your company and your space? And then finally, like, what are some example business models that either have been proven or maybe not be proven, but you can go down in terms of think about how to internalize that to your business. So this is the primer document that you put together. Greg walked through some examples of some successful Web3 deployments. Choosing like relevant case studies that work for your company, but also writing your own case study, right? And this is really meant to inspire. This is also meant to create a shared understanding of what's possible, right? So we walked through some of these examples. And this is a bit of an interesting framework. So what we've done here is we've taken the 4 Ps, but we've also overlaid something that a lot of corporations use, particularly when they're looking at deploying something new, which is how do we crawl, how do we walk, and how do we run, right? And that's basically like how do you ease into something new? How do you dip your toe in the water in terms of crawl, but then if you see some success, how do you lean in a little bit more? And if you really, really want to go big, how do you run, right? And so in terms of this, you'll see there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of crypto primitives. There's a lot of categories. There's a lot of different types of products. And the crawl in the middle is really around what's that low-hanging fruit opportunity, right? And based on where your company's at, like Greg was saying, you may want to basically specifically focus on a particular quadrant, right? We really want to go into sort of personas and finding new audiences, or we really want to lean into brand memberships and product and creating more community-driven approach. So this is a bit of a flexible framework that you can use to sort of map the art of the possible, but go really broad. Eventually, that needs to translate into something that's very a tangible roadmap. So this is an example of a large Las Vegas resort that's looking at how do I use this crawl walk approach around 3 dimensions of my business, right? One is how do I accept payments for services I'm providing today? How do I engage my customers in a deeper way using this new set of technologies and tools? But also, how do I use this to automate some of my back of the house or company processes? So this is an actual map that we use to identify, okay, these are some opportunity areas based on the last mapping exercise that we did where we think we want to start leaning into to due diligence and really see, do some of these concepts actually hold? And where do we want to place our bets, right? And in the beginning, typically with a new project, you have a limited source of resources, and you really have to focus. So you need to pick very strategically of what you're going to go next. Okay, I'll pass it over to Ryan. Absolutely.
Perfect. So I think as you've started to see, I hope, a theme emerge throughout this entire conversation that as you go on your own individual journey of understanding crypto, understanding the space, understanding how the community can rapidly evolve and start to build new types of things, one of the things that you have to do is sort of replicate that journey at scale, right? And that's what Greg and Zach were both talking about, this idea of synthesizing and reformatting and translating sort of what you're learning as an individual or your team is learning as they go through this exercise, and then taking it broadly, right, so that your entire organization can come along here. To rehash the old adage, right, if you want to actually go far, you have to go together. And this really, to do things well in this space really does require sort of a fundamental reimagination of what are your values as an organization, how do you bring things to life, what things are you trying to bring to life. And so once you've done this mapping exercise and you say, okay, from this snapshot of the world as we understand today, here are some things that we think could be very relevant for us, because what works for us is not what's going to work for FedEx or an MGM or any other company, right? Every company is sort of its own unique entity. Now you've not got to go out and sort of bring everyone else along on this journey, right? And you're doing this to educate and build that consensus, build that mind share. You're using it to validate not just your understanding of crypto or the Web3 space, but oftentimes, as you go through this exercise, you'll end up learning a lot about your own organization, no matter how long you've been there, right? So you deepen that understanding, you validate your mental model of how the world works, and then you start to refine these projects into a list of things that everyone's going to sign up for and go on a journey with you with. And you're going to have a lot of conversations, right? And this will be in our leave behind, but it's what we've highlighted here is just some of the things that you're going to see, because no matter what initiative you want to undertake, no matter where you want to start, whether it's something in payments, whether it's an activation campaign targeted at a new type of community, more or less what you're going to find is that in sort of these modern, efficient organizations, anything you touch has the risk of accidentally breaking everything else, right? And so what we've, at least that's the perception. And so, what we've highlighted here is a limited, by no means exhaustive, set of things that you're probably going to encounter, and we'll just sort of talk through that. This step right here is probably the most important step along the entire way, because when you're going out to talk about Web3, especially in an established organization, it's got additional dimensions of complexity and difficulty when compared to just talking about a normal technological innovation project, right? Like Greg was talking about, you're opening up conversations and questions about the fundamental values of the organization, who you work with, how you do things. And so you layer that element on top, you add a lot of complexity, and then you layer the final the final boss, so to speak, is the fact that given the volatility and sort of very public nature of the space and the way it changes from day to day, you're often going to encounter very strong opinions, especially at the C-level, that are often based on very little information. And you can't blame people, right? They're reacting to whatever they've seen in the latest Twitter thread. They're reacting to the last journal headline or the New York Times headline that's either talking, and often I think we all know the flavor of these things is, blockchain's going to solve world hunger and end all conflict. And then followed the next day, or even just scroll down the timeline slightly, and it's, blockchain is eating the planet, and it will destroy everything we hold dear. And you've got to work people through that, right? You need to meet them where they are, and you need to embrace that. And it doesn't mean shying away from some of these tough conversations. It doesn't mean like pretending that people don't get rugged or that projects go to zero. You have candid conversations, explain to people what's actually happening, what the underlying themes are, what the underlying technology enables, and what the structure of the new system could look like. And you'll find that they often end up becoming incredible allies and sort of laughing along with you when something blows up, which it will inevitably since the space is so new. But as you go through some of these functions, right, you need to be ready for these conversations, and you need to be very thoughtful about the needs and to have empathy for how the rest of the organization does their work and what they need to know and what they need to feel, more importantly, in order to get comfortable and come along with you. The first time you sit down with a vice president of treasury and you tell them that you're going to bring this incredibly volatile asset onto the books so that you can go potentially buy land in a virtual world, it's not a conversation I like to have frequently, but it's one that you need to go through, right? When you find at an organization, there's usually one person buried deep inside the bureaucracy at the senior manager or the director level who actually holds together all the financial systems of the entire company, right? And they've been doing their job for 20 years, but if you don't bring them along on a journey and you don't get their support, right, they can sort of quietly block you from implementing any of these things, right? When you talk about potentially implementing an NFT sale, that's going to potentially have secondary commercial relationships with customers that you and no one in your company will ever directly interact with, right, in the form of royalties that could be coming in sort of indefinitely into the future. That does present a lot of interesting challenges for your accounting team to think about and to manage, right? And just rolling through the list, when you talk to your marketers, you say, look, we're going to go from a very sophisticated broadcast-based model, and we're going to instead put branded assets out there for a community of people that we have very little control over to play with, to remix, to build things on top of. And guess what? We can't just turn it off if it doesn't go well. Those assets, once they're there, they're out there forever, right? They're on the chain. That's a new type of brand conversation, right? And it can be a little daunting at first when you think about, okay, how do you take the skill sets that we've developed and honed over the course of long, successful careers and then tell stories differently with our customers about the brand? For operations roles, and this is super important for anyone that's thinking about implementing something like this where you might have a large physical footprint, how do you think about organizational change management for 50,000 employees, right? When you're not just pushing people to a website, when people are going to have spontaneous encounters talking about something like a ticketing project or a new payments mechanism, right? How do you roll this out and make sure that all these people who are actually on the front lines running your business day to day, that they have the tools that they need to be super successful, right? To deliver that best-in-class guest experience and continue to not just run that core business, but start to experiment and explore and identify new ways that you as an internal community of people can grow and remix and reimagine your business going forward. Even basic things like refunds, right? We were talking about this last night at dinner. The fact that transactions on the blockchain are generally irreversible is a feature, not a bug. But if someone can't make their trip from Minnesota to Las Vegas all of a sudden and they need to refund $700 Cirque du Soleil tickets, they're really less obsessed about the ideology of an irreversible transaction, right? And you need to find ways to deliver these basic blocking and tackling features in a way that supports your entire team. And then finally, just sort of wrapping up, when you think about the people on the right, your digital teams, your security teams, they can be your greatest allies or some of your more challenging frenemies, right? Because they understand the technology. They're probably going to understand the technology more deeply than anyone else inside the organization, which means they're going to be even more tuned in to sort of the ever-evolving news cycle, the ups and downs of the space. But if you can work with them and show them that this is actually going to empower them to do their missions more successfully at a greater scale than before, then often they look at this as an opportunity to really get creative and start to do things differently and do the sort of innovation that digital groups often feel like they maybe aren't as empowered to do. So this is a representative sample. It's by no means exhaustive. And if there's questions about functions that we didn't list here or about specific things regarding these functions in those conversations that you'd like to talk about, please feel free to submit those questions and we'll get to those at the end. But you go through this exercise, right? And what you end up with after you've educated, validated, and refined is sort of a list of things. And your list might change, but you end up striking a bunch of things. You might have a chief accounting officer that says, okay, I'm comfortable handling a few transactions in crypto, but don't let it go over $500,000 and keep it off the balance sheet, in under 90 days or something like that, right? Or you'll go to the loyalty team and they'll say, you know what, we can maybe think about doing something like this, but not like that. And what you'll get is sort of a list of things that isn't just accurately reflective of your organization and what you're trying to accomplish, but now everyone's signed up to support. And this is super powerful because the kind of scariest moment in any innovation initiative is when you've been working on this thing, right? It's in a closed environment. It's a small group of people that are really going deep and feeling super creative. But now you've got to implement something at scale, right? And that transition is the hardest part. But if you do this piece well, you've now created not just a community of people who understand what you're trying to accomplish, but they're also excited and they're advocating for you when you're trying to bring this thing to life, whatever it ends up being, right? And for the example that we'll talk about today, which is where we were formerly at MGM Resorts, the two areas that people were comfortable exploring was this idea of, could we maybe look at cryptocurrencies as a new transaction type for one of our core businesses, which is room bookings? And then could we look at the potential of building a digital asset-based ticketing system, right, on top of NFTs? And so I'll talk about that for the last few minutes here before we get into questions. A quick refresh for anyone that, even if you go to Vegas a lot, you might not be super familiar with the brand. This is not the film studio. This is MGM Resorts International, and it's much more than just the hotel listed here. 42 global properties, 60-ish thousand employees in Southern Nevada, and really a truly global hospitality and entertainment brand that services the entire world. When we're talking about ticketing, what most people don't realize is that MGM Resorts is actually the third largest ticket distributor in the world after Ticketmaster and AEG. And so when you think about the scale and scope of what to a company like MGM is a secondary business, but if it existed on its own would be the third largest entertainment company in the world, it does present a lot of really interesting challenges when you start to look at, okay, how do we take the principles of Web3 and apply it to something like this business? And what we ended up doing was we went through an iterative process. We worked with stakeholders from across the whole organization, framing, again, these conversations about values, process, product, and people. And what we found at the convergence of those things was a partnership opportunity with a group called the Jabberwockies, an incredibly talented, very cool group of gentlemen who had had a residency at the MGM Grand for about 10 years. Some of the millennials in the audience might recognize them from America's Best Dance Crew 15 odd years ago. And what we did with them was we identified a partner who also was exploring the same convergence that we were at the same time we were, right? This is a broad, very diverse, global, culturally obsessed group of customers, right? It's a creative group that's always looking for ways to extend their IP, extend their universe, extend the way that they tell stories and connect with people. And we had an operations team and a technology team that was willing to support us doing something a little bit differently when it came to ticketing, right? And where we landed with this project was we did about 1,100 tickets in the month of April just this last year. And it was a whole package of things. In retrospect, we maybe reached to do too much utility and too much value. But in addition to the actual ticket, which you'll see here in 2 states that I'll talk about in a moment, we bundled a food and beverage offer that was able to be redeemed at an outlet that was adjacent to the theater. And then we did post-show collectible airdrop as well that allowed people to sort of feel connected to and linked to not just this artist, but the community of fans around the artist, right? And this was quite an adventure. The first lesson we learned is that ticketing in and of itself is extraordinarily difficult, not just for the refunds issues that I talked about before, but doing sort of a seated ticketing layout and making that work, given the front end challenges and just the immaturity of a lot of Web3 technology. It's a hard space, and it's made even harder when you try to do some of these new things with it. But we worked our way through that, and then we had to figure out, okay, after you scan, one of the things that we thought would be really interesting is you take this digital asset, but we want to really incentivize people to actually come to the show, right? Not just buy the NFTs and sit on them. At the end of the day, this is a butts and seats business. You want people there to consume the art. You want people there to enjoy the property before, during, and after the show. And so how do we incentivize people to do that? Well, in contrast with a normal ticketing asset that you might be used to, when you're interacting with this object on chain, we were able to actually set up a post-redemption flow such that once the ticket was scanned in at the door, it would go from a grayscale, and all these were animated, by the way, but it would go from a grayscale, very limited 5-second clip of video and become sort of this hyper-vibrant, longer 60-second clip of premium, unique dance content that was filmed just for this asset, right? And so we started, what we're trying to do here is start to turn the ticket into a living, breathing experience that was so much more than just something that got you through a door, right? And when you think about enhancing and up-leveling the products that you and your teams are bringing to life, it's really exciting to look at the new capabilities, look at composability, look at the ability to alter things based on their interactions with either other objects in the real world or other digital assets, and start to link those things together in ecosystems that cross multiple verticals inside your business, but also across your entire partner ecosystem. So we did that, but then we bumped into this issue that the chain was only updating every 15 to 30 seconds, And it turns out that peak for Ethereum at this point in time just happened to hit right when the doors opened on the weekends. And so you have people, scanning their tickets in, and you have ticket takers who are like, did it work? We have no idea, because the net hasn't pushed yet, so the redemption status hasn't shown, and it hasn't flipped over. But this was okay, right? These are the things that you need to support. These are the things that you have to be ready for, because the goal isn't necessarily to come out of the gates with a new world-class ticketing system or even a world-class anything. The goal is to go from nothing to just building the slightest bit of muscle around doing something that's new and potentially transformative when you take the long view of the space, right? So we worked our way through all of this. We did all the organizational change management with 500 union bartenders across 3 8-hour shifts, which was an adventure in and of itself. We managed to get all the credits redeeming, and we managed to get the airdrops going on time. And we had an enormous amount of success, an enormous amount of press that came out of this. We saw, without getting into the numbers too deeply, we saw average ticket prices go up. We saw people making trips specifically to participate in this collection and collect this item so that they would have it and extend their super fandom. And it was a really exciting project that the team is continuing to look at building on top of, and layering those learnings, not just in the entertainment space, but if you look at other artists, if you look at other experiences that you offer on property, starting to look at, even for our food and beverage outlets, right, where you've got a premium dining experience, potentially thinking about adding a collectible or adding some sort of digital layer on top of that. But it was an adventure, right, and it was a journey. And to do all of this took about a year of concentrated learning. It took hundreds of educational slides. It took hundreds of hours of meetings with everyone up, down, and across the organization to make this work. But at the end of the day, because we built a coalition, because we were able to sort of bring everyone on that learning journey with us, we actually saw an enormous amount of excitement, not just from the fans who ultimately consumed this thing, but from the people who helped bring it to life. And I think the proudest moment that we as a group had was not opening night of the show, because we were all exhausted and don't really remember much of that, but it was on the preview night where you actually had executives and team members from across the entire company packing into the theater, making time in their schedules to come and just experience this thing, to create their first wallet, to get their first NFT, right? And that is the moment that you can then build on once you have it inside your organizations. That's the moment, and that's the excitement that you build on that will make whatever the individual thing is very successful, but in the long run, make all of your initiatives super successful. And I'll wrap up here with just a few key principles that we found, that we keep coming back to, that we find very helpful, and that we think are super generalizable to anyone that's excited and interested in doing something in this space. The first is always look for purpose and substance, right? I think it's very tempting to do something that's flashy and something that's very quick, and you can do that. They have a place and a time. But if you want to be successful, if you want to bring other groups along, you always have to be reaching for driving real utility for your internal stakeholders and ultimately your customers, right? This needs to map back to enhancing the core business some way. And with just a little bit of creativity and elbow grease, every organization in this room will have opportunities where you can materially transform the business, maybe not in 2 weeks, but across 2 months or 2 years. There's going to be something in there that you can do. The second, echoing that last point, is to take the long view, but start today, right? I think it's impossible to keep up fully with the world of crypto. As soon as you turn off Twitter, 15 things have moved in a different direction. So take a snapshot, do your best, and then start building stuff. And that's really core to the Web3 ethos and the culture and the community. Ultimately, you can read all day, but the most important thing is just to get in there, get your hands under the hood, and start building things for your customers and for your company. And then the last thing is dream really big, right? It's good to laugh about some of the more pie in the sky, philosophical, let's change the world things. But at the same time, I think there's a little bit of wonder that is easy to lose when you're working for a big established organization. And so it's okay to have that spark of curiosity, that spark of excitement, and to think sort of like ridiculously big ideas about what your business could be or what it looks like. And balance that, though, with sort of these small incremental wins that are in the service of that larger vision, but that allow you to get started today and start taking not just your team, but again, the entire group down that long road towards building something that could be potentially new. And for a lot of the organizations in this room that have been around for decades, right, this is really going to impact and influence and give everyone the opportunity to co-create sort of what does the next half century of success look like for your enterprise, right? So that's that. Thank you so much for the time. Get out there, do something great, and we'd love to answer any questions, super tactical or otherwise, that might be helpful as you start on this journey.
We do have some questions that came in, quite a few, more questions than any other session yesterday, so this was an awesome topic. It was my favorite so far. No offense to anyone that spoke yesterday. All right, so I'm just gonna buzz through these and we'll see if they feel relevant to you. First one, how did you educate your consumers on the patient and getting how did you educate your consumers in getting wallets and receiving the NFT?
So it's one of the things that we realized very early on is that we weren't building for crypto degens, right? People that were deeply fluent they're carrying around a hard wallet in addition to everything else. We had to find partners and build technologies and operational flows that allowed people to have the utility of the NFT, right? The digital asset, the ownership, the membership, while sort of abstracting away from the complexity. So the ticketing partner in this case that we worked with, they were able to actually run a fiat or crypto front end. They were able to sort of generate a wallet for the customer in advance or in real time if they didn't have one already. And they were able to manage those assets for them using sort of like their own native app. These things are all compromises if you think about sort of the core principles of Web3, but at the end of the day, you have to meet people where they are, and you have to build something that they're excited to use. And over time, the goal is to progressively get towards more decentralization, to progressively get people to bring their own wallets rather than having us custody for them. But it's okay to start with something small. It's okay to start with sort of a small solution that's not fully decentralized and build from there.
Sometimes we jokingly say you got to get to Web 2.5 first
Yeah.
before you get to Web 3.
That's exactly so.
Okay, that was good. Who's typically the client sponsor in an organization?
That's interesting. I mean, you want to say it could be anyone.
Yeah, it could be anyone. You really need to find the sponsor who has the biggest pain point. In this case, when we started that sort of broad mapping exercise and that road mapping exercise, we found a client who actually had trouble moving money across borders. So we literally clinged onto that team and really went deep in understanding their problem and understanding how this technology could help solve that problem. Ultimately, that was a different product, different project that didn't necessarily go live in a big way, but that was that built the inertia to start building the coalition, start building, particularly like getting your legal team on board, your treasury team on board, your compliance team on board, because you need something for them to aim at to be able to understand how to contextualize this. So just finding that problem and spending 3 months learning and how to potentially solve that problem built a lot of know-how and understanding and comfort level. And so I think Ryan mentioned, like in some cases, you would have that first conversation would always be very uncomfortable, but by the time you've spent several months with that team and tried to unpack and deconstruct, by month 3, this becomes much more comfortable and easier to understand.
This one, they say, love the 4 Ps framework. How does this framework adapt when you onboard friends and family? I'd love to hear a personal story. And I hear this all the time when I'm telling people about, I'm speaking at this summit. They're like, crypto bros. You know, there's different stereotypes that exist in this world, right? So how do you talk to people, and I would add on to this, how do you talk to people in the business world so they don't take on that stereotype?
Yeah, sure. So I think the 4Ps are very flexible, right? They use them in combination, right? And I think, much to the point, I guess, about finding an internal client, and very much in the same vein, depending on the quadrant you're in, or what's going to draw that person out the most, right? So some people they're suffering from a problem themselves, right? Like maybe they don't understand. You think about like the crypto space itself, right? Like NFTs opened up way more people to Web3 than tokens did, right? Tickets, we were talking about this last night, I think will be like a much bigger opener to like the whole world, probably to get into Web3 without even realizing it, right? So I think if you can identify like sort of that core problem that someone is having, like you can put it in a quadrant, and then you just work your way, like usually they work in diagonals, right? So like a perspective change usually means changing the processes to sort of get to where we want, versus like a new product is usually for a new persona, right? And so you can use these forces like any way that they are gonna be helpful for you, but don't feel like bound to it. It's just more of a guidance really, right?
This one was a personal question. What were your first NFTs, and how did you each individually get into the space?
Sure. So my first, I'm trying to think here. My first set of NFTs that were truly mine were actually the tickets that we released, which was sort of an irony, right? And this is why I keep coming back, and you have to sometimes force yourself to really get into the space in a material way if you're excited. I realized I had been researching and working on crypto for 3 to 5 months, trying to figure it out for this organization. And one day I woke up and I realized I don't own any tokens. Like, that's absolutely absurd. So before I even got out of bed, I opened up a Coinbase account and bought my first $100 of Bitcoin. Of course, it was at the all-time high, which I love. So I like to open that up every once in a while and just see if we're back above $40. But that's how I got started, and it was really just getting excited. To Greg's point, was the breakthrough for me was just realizing this isn't some abstract thing that people are doing in Discords and on Twitter. This is something that's very material to the experiences in the industries and the customers that I've spent my career taking care of and really falling in love with. And once you cross that leap, it really just makes it so easy to start participating.
Mine was a visitor NFT, and I must have spent like $700 doing it all wrong. It was on Polygon. Don't start on Polygon. Very, very bad experience. But it's like, the funny thing was like moving the money around and like just figuring out, and I'm like, crap, I didn't move enough, and then I had to like keep going back, and then it was terrible. But after I did that, I probably own about 300 now. So that was the first one about a year and a half ago, 17 months ago.
Yeah, mine was to buy an NFT to play a game, and I think it worked on the 4th try. So it broke every single time. The process just it was either something with the chain, something with the wallet. It was just very painful, and then just that quickly made you realize like how much friction there is from the customer experience today.
Any questions live that anybody wants to ask in the room?
Thank you for the really great discussion this morning. Really appreciate it. On the MGM case study, I'm curious if you would do anything different from an engineering perspective. You mentioned a few bumps in the road. How do you do good, non-functional testing and load testing considerations, especially when so many players are involved in the ecosystem?
I think what I would say is it's not necessarily Web3 advice. I think it's just general innovation advice, especially when you're working with partnerships. Managing expectations is so key, right? So often you'll find a startup partner to work with, and they're incredibly excited. This feels like a huge breakthrough for them after being told they're crazy for months and months and months. And the temptation on their end will be to overpromise and underdeliver, right? And so really being clear with them that, look, if that feature is not there, or if that feature is going to be a reach, tell us now so that we can work around it and adjust accordingly, right? And then internally, I think the conversation, the one thing that I might tweak a little bit differently would be, you put it's an inverse version of the same problem. You push and push and push and push. You bring everyone on this journey. The whole company gets super excited. Now you have to go back and manage your own expectations and manage everyone else's to say like, look, the learning objective here is proving whether or not we can just do something really small and drive some small changes in behavior. This is not going to completely revolutionize our business model overnight, right? This is, the collection may not sell out immediately, and that's okay, right? But it's really just having, even though you're at the center of this storm, so to speak, really just keeping a clear head and managing sort of everyone so that people have the infrastructure and the sort of psychological safety they need to set clear expectations, do as much preparation as possible, but then be okay when stuff gets a little squirrely on the night of, right?
Yeah, it's a defining success because, someone might expect you to all of a sudden create a $20, $30, $50 million business overnight. Just, that doesn't happen very often.
All right, we had another one up here.
Yeah, thank you for the great panel discussion. This is Bo. Great on starting, building, and talking about the Web3 strategy. Your perspectives on ESG and how the impact investment world can align on our, I would say, building strategy for Web3 and all-inclusive. Your thoughts on ESG, which is environmental social governance, and to me, DE&I practices fall under ESG, the diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, please.
I actually, I think it's a great area because remember I was saying earlier about quarantining kind of something that you might want to do that maybe it's hard to get full buy-in for. I think like a great place for Web3 in traditional orgs is the CSR department, right? Because you sort of already decided that you're going to sort of allocate some funds to like, some like woo-woo kind of things, right? Like that are a little out there. This is a great opportunity to like co-develop that with your customers. You could operate it as a DAO. You could like bring the customers into the fold, give them a vote, or maybe, control of like how these resources are deployed. So I think like this is a great opportunity to use that as a way to kickstart sort of an effort, right? So if you're doing like an ESG effort, CSR efforts, Web3 is actually a great proving ground for that stuff because you sort of, even though, again, it goes to the cultural parts, it's not the technology, right? But the ethos of Web3 highly facilitates, I think, having better conversations in that arena.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would agree with that 100%. It's basically bringing the community and getting them more involved in your ESG efforts, whether it's in a way to contribute, in a way to make decisions and governance around projects. I think it's a fantastic place to start.
Yeah. The only thing I would add would be that, this is going to be part of those conversations that you have, right? There's a lot of people who are still, they saw an article last year about proof of work, right? And it's destroying the Amazon or something. and it's a real concern. It's a real objection, right? And so as you're looking to scope things, right, making sure that you're explicit in talking about and looking at partners and technologies in this space that align with your company's values, that align with the way that you do things. One of the initiatives that we unfortunately didn't get to do, MGM has the largest privately owned solar array in the Western United States. And apparently, that doesn't mean that we can set up a crypto rig on top of it and start mining things. But again, like these are just part of the conversations that you're going to have. And like Greg was saying, it's community, it's environment, it's because the values are manifested in the technology. It's going to be part of that conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, guys. Let's give them a round of applause for that great session.